In the 19th century United States, a series of political compromises failed to resolve the untenable contradiction between the notion of American freedom and the institution of slavery. Historian James Horton traces the crises over slavery that inevitably led to the Civil War.
Slavery is America's most significant contradiction at the time of the American birth. America, this nation, brought into existence with a fundamental commitment to human freedom. America, this nation, brought into an existence that will build its fortune literally on the backs of human slaves. This is America's greatest contradiction. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, this is a contradiction that is so central to what America is about. It is a contradiction that is so difficult for Americans to deal with that if you look at the words in the American Constitution, you will not find the word slave or slavery there until the 13th Amendment, which incidentally is not added to the American Constitution until 1865. Compromise is the way in which Americans go about trying to deal with the issue of slavery, just as they have tried to use compromise to deal with other kinds of issues on which they disagree. As America grows larger and larger as a nation, as America becomes a nation which, after 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, more than doubles the size of the nation. And I put this up here because I always like to let people understand how large this Louisiana Purchase is, because some people think the Louisiana Purchase is only the present state of Louisiana. The southern part of this area is an area which there is going to be a major debate over in terms of its availability for the expansion of the institution of slavery. I really like the title of this conference. The title of this conference, which makes clear to anyone who reads it that slavery is an issue that is an issue for New England as well as an issue for the South. Slavery was not an institution simply limited to the South. Although what we see is, as this area of the New South becomes available with the purchase of the Louisiana area, slavery does tend to move from the Chesapeake region of Maryland and Virginia and the South Carolina region. It does tend to move westward and southward into the lower region of what is there, the Louisiana Purchase. As slavery moves into that area, and as our nation grows in size, the question becomes, where will the northern limit of slavery be fixed? Compromise, the Missouri Compromise. Around 1820, there is this debate about the expansion of the United States by bringing in the state of Missouri. How is this going to be done? At that point, there are 11 slave states and 11 free states. The question becomes, if we bring in Missouri as a slave state, then we'll be more slave states than free states. So the compromise is, you fix the northern limit of the expansion of slavery at the southern border of this new state of Missouri, the 3630 parallel, and you bring in a free state to balance off Missouri, that free state of Maine, and again we keep the balance. 12 slave, 12 free states. Again, compromise works. As we go through the period before 1850, every time there are new areas brought into the nation, every time there is this debate, shall these areas be open to slavery? Well, the debate gets hotter and hotter. It particularly gets hot after there is gold discovered in California, because there's great fortune to be made there. And there is the need to decide about how California is to be brought into the United States, whether California is to be a state that will allow slavery. Yet, The whole issue of slavery, and especially this is true with the rise of the anti-slavery movement and the rise of the most vocal anti-slavery movement after the 1830s and the 1840s, you know, it's during the 1830s, 1840 periods when anti-slavery organizations are taking up petitions by the hundreds, are sending names of voters by the thousands and tens of thousands into Congress. So many that Congress finds it very difficult to deal with this. They don't want to have this conversation. They didn't have it during the Constitutional Convention. They don't want to have it during subsequent meetings of Congress. And finally, as I say, in 1836, they passed what is called the gag rule, where they don't have to deal with this issue. Now, of course, John Quincy Adams, he issues his own campaign to force Congress to deal with the issue of slavery, even though Congress doesn't want to. And he carries on this battle from the middle 1830s to the middle 1840s. Finally, in 1845, there is the repeal of the gag rule, and once again, Congress is put in a position where it must at least acknowledge the will of many of its constituents. 1850 is a critical year, the beginning of a critical decade. It is the decade and the year that sees the end of the effectiveness of compromise in American politics on this issue of slavery. The Compromise of 1850 was so difficult that the compromise was literally passed as 5 bills. They couldn't pass it as 1 bill. It brought California in as a free state. The compromise ends the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Not slavery, but the slave trade is brought to an end in the District of Columbia. And one of the most controversial features of the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. In the 1850s Fugitive Slave Law, America has the most harsh fugitive slave law ever passed in this nation. This fugitive slave law provided that a person could be charged with being a fugitive, and if so charged, had no right to an attorney, had no right to a jury trial, had no right to speak in their own behalfs in defense of themselves. And very interestingly, any person, any citizen in the United States could be deputized on the spot and forced to participate in the capture and return of a person charged with being a fugitive. This was the most controversial part of this Compromise of 1850. There were lots of people who hoped that this Compromise of 1850 would be the final settlement. But it quickly became clear that there were people in American society, some of them black and some of them white, who were determined that this would not be the final word. The senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, called it legalized outrage, this fugitive slave law. He said, quote, "It is the worst atrocity, the grossest infamy in all of the annals of governmental crime." Chicago's City Council passed a resolution calling this fugitive slave law unconstitutional, calling the supporters of the fugitive slave law as Benedict Arnolds, and calling for the death of slave catchers in the city. In the African American community, the fugitive slave law was a shock, it was maddening, it was transformative. Many African Americans had been strong supporters of William Lloyd Garrison's nonviolent tenets. There was a very important process underway, the process of radicalization, especially in the free black community. Many were becoming convinced that their rights were under attack by the federal government, and many were becoming convinced that they must do something immediately. Now, part of what free African Americans did immediately, even those who had never been slaves but had been free all of their lives, but certainly many who were fugitives and who had lived in the North, sometimes for decades. Immediately after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, many of them left the country. But the most important response, which made compromise during this decade virtually impossible, was a violent response. Because ultimately it is the rise of violence in many different areas of American life which makes this compromise of 1850 untenable and brings America closer and closer to a civil war. There is violence in the East. There is violence among African Americans who refuse to allow their brethren, many of whom are their relatives, to be taken into slavery. There is a refusal to allow fugitives to be taken. Vigilance committees, these are committees that are set up starting in the 1840s and increasingly during the 1850s to shelter and protect fugitives. These vigilance committees become extremely active and grow in number. In 1854, in the city of Boston, there is the attempt to capture and return to slavery Anthony Burns. Anthony Burns is from Virginia, who comes to Boston, works in Boston for a short period, and then finally he is captured, and the slave catchers are about to return him to the South. There are two major meetings in Boston over this Anthony Burns case. One is an integrated meeting that, in which William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, many well-known abolitionists debate what should be done to rescue, to save Anthony Burns. Another meeting, this was a black meeting, and at this meeting there was not much debate about what should be done. The debate was, when shall we do it? Those from the African American meeting left that meeting determined to go to the federal courthouse where Anthony Burns was being held and to free him at all costs. They then sent runners to the Faneuil Hall integrated meeting to say to them, join us. This group emerged in the square in front of the federal courthouse. They ringed the courthouse and proceeded to smash the windows and to demand the release of Anthony Burns. James Batchelder, who was the federal marshal, was killed in the confrontation that took place. But ultimately, Anthony Burns was not taken. And finally, he was taken back to the South. He was marched down State Street. The windows of the shops along the street were draped in crepe. There was a coffin that was suspended across the street that said, "Liberty." And thousands of people walked into Boston from as far away as Worcester to watch the shame of Boston and the return of Anthony Burns. But the Anthony Burns case was pivotal because that was one important example of how a single case involving a slave, in which a slave becomes not a symbol but a human being, how a case like that can raise the consciousness of people. Let me quote you from a letter that was written by George Hillard. Now, George Hillard was a conservative Whig. He was not an abolitionist. But he writes to a friend, and he says this: "When it was over, I was left alone in my office. I put my face in my hands and wept. What could I do?" Newspaper reported that the Boston police were changed by this taking of Anthony Burns. And one quote says, "They were left wondering in the innocence of their hearts how one man could own another." The fugitive slave law was enforced at cost, at a great cost. A cost to the federal government, a cost to the supporters of slavery, obviously a cost to the fugitive slaves. It was growing increasingly clear that violence would be necessary if African Americans were to resist the fugitive slave law. And that was part of the violence in the East. But there was also violence in the West. In the early 1850s, there was this great debate about the expansion of the nation and the extent to which a transcontinental railroad would aid in this expansion. Stephen A. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, wanted this transcontinental railroad to go through Chicago. Now, if it went through Chicago, it would go through the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Those territories would then have to be organized in some way. But comes the question, would those territories be open to the institution of slavery or not? Stephen A. Douglas worked out this, what he called democratic solution. He called it squatter sovereignty, and it went this way. Let the people out there vote. Let the people in those territories decide for themselves whether they wanted those territories to be open to slavery or closed to slavery. What he did was to set up a situation in which the forces of anti-slavery and the forces of slavery clashed, and set up the possibility of this war that ultimately did begin in Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, it was called. It is in Bleeding Kansas that we first hear the name John Brown. It is in Bleeding Kansas that many people argue that the Civil War started. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Bleeding Kansas really was a major part of the cause of violence during this period, not only the violence that went on in Kansas, but the violence that went on as a part of a response to Kansas. In 1856, the senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, was responding to a pro-Kansas-Nebraska Act speech that was made by the senator from South Carolina. He said of Andrew Butler, an aging but venerable and well-respected senator from South Carolina, he said of Butler, in fact, he called him a noisome, squat, nameless animal from whose tongue flows the perpetual stench of offensive personality. Charles Sumner had a way with words. A relative of Senator Butler accosted Sumner on the floor of the Senate, sitting at his desk. He beat him so badly, he broke the cane, and he beat him so badly that Sumner was forced to withdraw from the House in terms of his participating in the House Senate affairs for a number of years. From the standpoint of Massachusetts, their senator had been attacked by pro-slavery. We regard every blow against our senator as a blow against the state of Massachusetts, they said. From the standpoint of the South, students at Virginia Military Institute sent Preston Brooks cane after cane after cane to replace the cane that he had broken by beating Charles Sumner. Again, what we're seeing here is violence being sanctioned and even applauded. There were people killed, politicians killed in Washington in duels. It was virtually impossible to have a decent cocktail party because you never could be sure of who would bring what kind of weapon. And there is violence also at the hands of the federal government, violence directed at African American citizenship. In 1857, a slave from Missouri, Dred Scott, appeals through his local court, through his state court, through his district court, finally to the Supreme Court of the United States, arguing that because he has spent long years outside of slave territory, his master was a military officer and was stationed for a very long time in Minnesota, and took Dred Scott with him. And Dred Scott said that because he had lived outside of slave territory for so long, he should be able to be a free man. And as I said, it went through appeal after appeal after appeal, and finally it got to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, himself a Southerner, said Dred Scott cannot receive his freedom. Dred Scott had no right to apply for his freedom through the Supreme Court or through the court system, because Dred Scott, and then he went on to say, and no African American person, was a citizen of the United States. African Americans had never been, were not then, and could not be citizens of the United States, and as such had, direct quote, no rights which white men were bound to respect. Here was a violent attack by the federal government on black citizenship, and African Americans were incensed. Had they not fought in with the revolutionary forces to bring America into existence, had they not served in the War of 1812 to protect American freedom? In the middle 1850s, African Americans start to form military units in Boston, in Cincinnati, in Washington, Philadelphia, and New York. These military units are being formed in the expectation that a war is going to come, and that war is going to be a war that ends slavery, that brings slavery to its knees. Now, such a war is necessary, because think about it for a moment. Without war, there is no way that slavery could have been abolished in American society. First of all, let me point out very quickly that slavery was no sideshow in American society. Slavery was the main event. Here we have a chart which shows you the value of cotton exports as a percentage of American exports. Very briefly, this is what the chart says. It says that by 1820, in fact, it should say by 1815, because that's when it really occurs. By 1815, cotton, that is the chief slave crop, is the most valuable thing this nation exports. Not the South, the entire nation. By 1840, cotton is more valuable than everything else this nation exports put together. You realize that by 1860, the value of human slaves was greater than the value of all of America's banks, all of America's railroads, all of America's manufacturing put together. Slavery was no sideshow in American society. Slavery was the main event. And the biggest problem that African Americans and their white allies had in going up against the institution of slavery was the economic and the political power of that institution. As David Bryan Davis has pointed out, of the 72 years between the election of George Washington and the election of Abraham Lincoln, 50 of those years saw a slaveholder in the White House. By the time we get to the dawn of the Civil War, pro-slavery South controlled the Supreme Court, most of the major committees in both houses of Congress. There is no way that slavery could have been abolished except by violence. You couldn't pass a bill, the South was too strong. You couldn't pass an amendment, the South was too strong. In 1859, John Brown, which his raid on Harper's Ferry in many ways becomes the ultimate violence of the period. He goes against the institution of slavery. His plan may not have been as practical or as well worked out as it should have been, but the idea was one with which African Americans agreed with wholeheartedly. John Brown's plan failed, in that John Brown did not free the slaves in the vicinity of Harper's Ferry, and John Brown was martyred. His martyrdom becomes an important factor in the refusal of those in the North, black and white, finally to allow the Compromise of 1850 to stand. And so when Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency in 1860, and South Carolina leads the South out of the United States of America, when the South is not willing to accept the President of the United States as their leader, when the South establishes the Confederate States of America, and even the last attempt at compromise, something called the Crittenden Compromise, which would have, among other things, protected the institution of slavery, the South is not convinced that the North can be trusted. The South is not convinced that the fugitive slave law is going to be enforced. Slavery becomes the Southern reason for leaving the United States of America. I would not argue that in 1860 or 1861 the majority of the North would go to war to end slavery, but I would argue strongly that the South left the United States of America in order to protect slavery. Let me quote to you a Georgia editor, who said in 1861, Negro slavery is the South, and the South is Negro slavery. Finally, in order for us to understand American society, in order for us to understand the extent to which the Civil War came as a second American Revolution, in order for us to understand how compromise could not work finally, we have to understand the extent to which abolitionists, black and white, were willing to work together to make compromise that would maintain and protect the institution of slavery impossible. During the 1850s, American democracy broke down. It ceased to function. Compromise ceased to be the glue that would hold America together. The reason for that is that this issue was so contradictory to what America said of itself, what it thought itself to be, what it announced to the world that it was. That is, this nation built on a belief in human freedom. Slavery was so much of a contradiction that that contradiction could not be compromised. And in this regard, slavery is central to understanding American history during this time. And in this regard, slavery is central not only to African American history, but also to American history. And I leave you with these words. African American history is American history, made by Americans in America. Thank you.
Funding for Slavery and Freedom in New England was made possible by a generous contribution from Yale University.